The chains rattled before the screaming started. Ren pressed her back against the stone wall of the corridor as the sound rolled toward her, deep and inhuman, shaking dust loose from the ceiling above. The guards on either side of her did not move to help. They only stared straight ahead, spears gripped tight, faces pale as candle wax. The torches lining the corridor flickered wildly, as though even the flames themselves shrank away from whatever waited behind the iron door ahead. Ren could feel the cold radiating from the stone beneath her palms, could hear her own heartbeat pounding loud enough to nearly drown out the guard's hushed, frightened breathing beside her. She had faced difficult moments before in her years as a healer, wounds that bled too freely, fevers that refused to break, but nothing in her training had prepared her for the raw animal dread that gripped this entire corridor. "That is him," whispered the older guard, a man named Callum, his voice barely audible over the noise. "That is the king." Ren swallowed hard and looked toward the iron door at the end of the hall. Behind it, something enormous slammed against stone, again and again, like a storm, trying to break free of a cage far too small to hold it. She had traveled 3 days to reach this fortress, carried in a cart with barely a blanket to keep out the cold, escorted by soldiers who refused to speak to her the entire journey. She had known, from the moment the elders in her village chose her name, that this was likely a one-way road. No Omega sent to the Ashbourne fortress had ever returned. The stories said the king had gone feral years ago, that whatever curse lived in his blood had eaten away the man and left only the beast. The stories said he killed anyone who came too close. And yet here she stood, only steps away from his door, because the alternative was worse. Her village had lost its harvest to the war between kingdoms, its young men to the fighting, its food stores to soldiers who took what they pleased. The treaty said the war would end if the Ashbourne king took a mate from the conquered territories. One person traded for peace. Ren had volunteered before anyone else could be forced into it. "You do not have to go in tonight," Callum said quietly. "The council said you could wait until morning." "If I wait, I will lose my courage," Ren answered. "Better to go now, while my fear is still small enough to carry." Callum studied her for a long moment, something like pity crossing his weathered face. "Do not look him in the eyes. Do not run. Running wakes something in him that cannot be called back. And do not, under any circumstance, touch him first." "I understand." "No," Callum said, shaking his head slowly. "You do not. But you will learn quickly, or you will not learn at all." He lifted the heavy iron bar from its brackets and pushed the door open just enough for her to slip through, then shut it behind her at once, as though even a few extra seconds of exposure to the room beyond might cost him his life. The chamber inside was dark, lit only by a single torch bracket near the ceiling, its flame guttering in a draft that seemed to come from nowhere. The air smelled of iron and old smoke. Ren's eyes adjusted slowly, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Chains, thick as her wrist, ran from 4 points in the stone walls to a heavy iron collar, and within that collar, crouched low against the far wall like an animal cornered by hunters, was a man. He did not look like the paintings she had seen of kings. His hair was long and matted, dark as a raven's wing, hanging over eyes that glowed faintly amber in the dim light. His shoulders were broad enough to fill a doorway, his bare chest crossed with old scars, some silver with age, others still an angry red. His hands ended in claws where nails should have been, and when he turned his head toward her, a low sound rolled out of his chest that was not quite a growl and not quite a word. This was Draven Ashbourne, the feral Alpha King. Ren's instincts screamed at her to run, to pound on the door and beg Callum to let her out. But she thought of her village, of the empty fields and the children who cried from hunger at night, and she forced her feet to stay planted. She did not look him in the eyes, remembering Callum's warning. Instead, she lowered her gaze to the floor, and slowly, carefully, sank to her knees. "My name is Ren," she said, keeping her voice low and even, the way she might speak to a wounded animal in her village, back when she still worked as a healer among ordinary people with ordinary wounds. "I have come a long way to meet you." The growling stopped. She heard chains shift, heard the faint scrape of claws against stone as he moved, closer this time. Every part of her wanted to flinch, to scramble backward, but she held herself still, breathing slow and steady, the way she had taught herself to do when tending to frightened creatures who did not understand that her hands meant no harm. A shadow fell over her. She could feel the heat of him now, feel a presence that seemed far too large for the room. Warm breath stirred the loose hair at her temple. She kept her eyes down, kept her hands open and visible at her sides, palms up, the universal sign of someone who carried no weapon and meant no threat. "They sent you to die," a voice rasped above her. It was rough, broken in places, as though speech itself had become unfamiliar to him, like all the others. "They sent me because I asked to come," Ren said. "Not because I wish to die. Because I wish for my people to live." Silence stretched between them, heavy and strange. She dared to lift her eyes just slightly, enough to see his hands. They trembled, not with weakness, but with the effort of holding something back. A war was happening inside him, plain to see, even for someone who had never met him before tonight. "You should be afraid," he said. "I am afraid," she admitted. "But fear does not have to make my choices for me." Something shifted in the amber glow of his eyes. For just a moment, so brief she almost thought she imagined it, the wildness in them seemed to recede, like storm clouds parting to reveal a sliver of clear sky beneath. Then it was gone, and he pulled back from her with a sound of frustration, retreating to the far wall, chains dragging behind him. "Leave," he said, "before I cannot stop myself." Ren did not move at first. She studied him from her place on the floor, this powerful, broken creature crouched among his own chains, and something in her healer's heart refused to simply walk away. "I will come back tomorrow," she said. "No one comes back." "I am not no one," Ren answered, and rose slowly to her feet, careful and unhurried, before backing toward the door and knocking softly for Callum to let her out. When the door shut behind her, she found herself shaking, her knees weak, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her own ears. Callum stared at her with wide eyes, as though he had expected to find her in pieces. "You are alive," he said, sounding genuinely stunned. "For now," Ren answered. Her mind drifted back, as it often did in quiet moments, to the reasons that had brought her this far from home in the first place. The war between the two kingdoms had raged for nearly 5 years before the treaty was proposed, 5 years during which her village had watched its harvests requisitioned, its young men conscripted, its healers stretched thin treating wounds that never seemed to stop arriving. Her own brother had marched off to the southern border 2 years earlier, and never returned, his fate unknown even now, swallowed somewhere in the chaos of a conflict that had cost both kingdoms far more than either could afford to lose. When the elders first announced the treaty's terms, that an Omega healer be sent north to serve as mate to the Ashborn king in exchange for peace, the village had fallen into a heavy, uncertain silence. No one wished to volunteer a daughter or sister for what everyone assumed would be a death sentence, given the stories that had traveled south about the fortress and its feral ruler. Ren had stepped forward before the silence could stretch too long, driven by a stubborn conviction that someone needed to try, and that her healing skills, however limited against whatever madness gripped the Northern King, gave her better odds than most. She had not told her mother of her decision until the arrangements were already finalized, knowing the older woman would have fought fiercely against it despite understanding, as well as anyone, the desperate need for peace. Their final embrace before Ren departed had been long and wordless, both of them understanding that promises of safe return would have rung hollow given everything they had heard about the fortress in the north. The galaxy. She was given a small room near the servants' quarters, far from the grand chambers where a proper queen might have stayed. She did not mind. She sat by the narrow window, looking out over the dark hills surrounding the fortress, and thought about the man she had just met. Not a beast, she realized. Not truly. Something wild lived in him. Yes, something that clawed and growled and made grown soldiers pale with fear. But beneath that wildness, she had seen something else. A flicker, a moment where the storm in his eyes had cleared. She thought of her training as a healer, of the years she had spent learning to read a person's body, for signs the mind could not put into words. Fever, pain, poison. She had seen madness before in her village, the slow kind that came from grief or age, and she had seen the fast kind that came from sickness of the blood. What she had witnessed in that chamber did not look like either. It looked like something being forced upon him. She resolved, lying in the narrow bed that night, that she would return in the morning, and the morning after that, no matter what the council or the guards believed about her chances. She had not traveled 3 days, and left her entire life behind to give up after a single meeting, however dangerous that meeting had been. Somewhere far above her, in a chamber wrapped in iron and shadow, the king of Ashbourne lay curled against cold stone, breathing hard, fighting a battle that had raged inside him for longer than he could remember. And for the first time in longer than he could recall, he found himself thinking not of blood or rage, but of a soft voice that had not trembled when it spoke his name. Trust was not a thing either of them expected to find in that room, but something had been planted there all the same, small and fragile as a single seed dropped into cracked stone, waiting to see if anything could grow. In the servants' quarters below, a young woman named Ilara sat mending a torn sleeve by candlelight, listening to the fortress settle into its usual uneasy silence. She had worked within these walls since childhood, long enough to remember the whispered stories that circulated whenever a new Omega arrived, and long enough to have watched too many of them leave in coffins rather than carriages. When she heard soft footsteps pass her door, she recognized them immediately as belonging to the newcomer, the healer everyone had already begun calling brave, or foolish, depending on who told the story. She rose and opened her door just enough to catch a glimpse of Wren moving quietly toward her small room at the end of the hall, still pale from whatever she had witnessed behind that iron door. "You are the one they sent to the king," Ilara said softly, stepping into the corridor. Wren turned, startled, before recognizing the kindness in the other woman's face, rather than the usual mixture of pity and morbid curiosity she had grown used to since arriving. My name is Wren." "Ilara," the young woman answered, offering a small, tired smile. "I have worked in this fortress since I was a child. I remember the king before his illness, if it can even be called that. He was not always the way he is now." Wren's interest sharpened immediately. "What was he like?" Ilara glanced down the corridor, as though checking for unwanted listeners, before beckoning Wren into her small room and closing the door softly behind them. "He was quiet, even then, but not unkind. He used to walk the fortress grounds at dawn, before anyone else woke, simply to watch the sunrise over the hills. The servants adored him. He remembered our names, asked after our families, insisted the kitchen staff be paid fairly even during lean harvests. It was only after his father's death, when he took the crown, that things began to change." "How quickly did the change happen?" Wren asked, already turning the timeline over in her mind, comparing it against what she had begun to suspect. "Slowly," Ilara said. "So slowly that none of us noticed at first. A little more temper here, a little more distance there. By the time anyone realized how far he had fallen, it seemed as though it had always been that way, as though the illness had simply been waiting beneath the surface all along, ready to claim him the moment he took the throne." Wren sat with this information long after she returned to her own room that night, turning it over alongside everything else she had observed. A change that began precisely when Draven took the crown, growing slowly and steadily rather than striking all at once, was not the pattern of a sudden curse or an inherited madness triggered by grief. It was the pattern of something deliberate, something introduced gradually, and increased carefully over time, by a hand patient enough to avoid suspicion. She thought of Edmund, the uncle who had stepped so smoothly into the role of regent once his nephew's condition worsened, and felt the first cold thread of suspicion begin to take root, long before she had gathered any concrete proof to support it. The next morning came gray and cold, mist clinging to the fortress walls like a second skin. Wren woke before the sun had fully risen, her body stiff from the hard bed and the tension of the previous night, but her mind clear and determined. She dressed quickly in the plain wool dress she had been given, tied her dark hair back from her face, and made her way through the quiet corridors toward the kitchens, where she hoped to find something useful before facing the king again. The kitchen staff eyed her with open curiosity as she entered. Word had clearly spread that the new Omega had survived her first night, an event rare enough to draw whispers from every corner of the fortress. "You are the healer," said a woman stirring a pot over the hearth, not quite a question. She was older, gray streaking her dark hair, her hands rough from years of work. "I am Mira. I have run this kitchen for 11 years, since before the sickness took the old king and left us with his son, Wren," she answered. "I would like to help, if I am allowed. I have some skill with herbs and remedies." Mira studied her for a long moment, then gestured to a stool near the fire. The council keeps us busy enough. What is it you wish to help with? The king's meals, Ren said carefully. I noticed things last night, things that made me curious. Mira's expression shifted, just slightly, a flicker of something guarded crossing her face before she smoothed it away. The tray goes up at midday and again at sunset. Bread, meat, and wine. He eats little of it most days. The guards say he grows worse after each meal, not better. Ren filed that detail away carefully. Worse after each meal. That was not the behavior of ordinary hunger, or ordinary madness. That was the pattern of something else entirely. Something she had seen before, in cases far less dramatic than a king locked in chains. May I prepare his tray myself today? She asked. Mira was quiet for a moment, her hands stilling over the pot she had been stirring, before she set down her spoon entirely and turned to face Ren with an expression that carried more weight than the simple question seemed to warrant. I lost a sister to this fortress, she said quietly. Not to the king directly, but to the fear that spread through these halls once his condition worsened. She served as a lady's maid to the old queen, years before your arrival, and she took her own life, rather than face what she believed the future held for all of us. Trapped within walls she was convinced would never know peace again. I have watched this fortress hollow out around that fear for longer than I care to remember. Ren's chest tightened at the admission, understanding suddenly why Mira's guarded expression had softened so readily toward a stranger willing to risk herself for the king's recovery. I am sorry for your loss, she said gently. I do not tell you this for sympathy, Mira continued, though her voice carried unmistakable emotion. I tell you because I have watched every previous attempt to help this king fail. Watched hope rise and fall within these walls more times than I can count. If you truly believe you can help him, truly believe there is something worth fighting for, beneath all that fear and madness, then I will give you whatever assistance I can offer, without hesitation. Thank you, Ren said softly. I do believe it. I believed it from the very first night, watching him fight so hard against something clearly separate from his own nature. Then the tray is yours, Mira said, wiping her eyes briskly, before returning to her usual brisk efficiency, though something had shifted between them in that moment, a bond forged from shared understanding of loss, and the stubborn hope that still refused to die despite it. I will show you everything, every ingredient, every step. If there is poison hiding somewhere in these preparations, we will find it together. Ren spent the morning in the kitchen, watching carefully as the usual ingredients were prepared, noting each one, memorizing the source of the bread, the cut of meat, the cask from which the wine was poured. Nothing seemed obviously amiss to the untrained eye, but Ren had not survived years of healing work by trusting only her eyes. She had learned to trust her nose, her instincts, and the small signs the body gave when something was wrong. When midday came, she carried the tray up the long staircase herself, her arms trembling slightly under the weight, her heart pounding harder, with every step that brought her closer to that iron door. Callum met her at the top of the stairs, surprise plain on his face. You are going back in? I told him I would. Most people who make promises to that room do not keep them a second time. I am not most people, Ren said, echoing her own words from the night before, though she did not feel nearly as certain as she sounded. The door opened, and she stepped once again into the dim chamber. Draven was crouched in nearly the same position as before, chains pooled around him, his head lifting slowly as she entered. His eyes tracked her movement, the amber glow within them sharp and watchful. You came back, he said, voice rough with disuse. I said I would. Ren set the tray down carefully, well within his reach, but far enough that she could retreat if needed, and knelt on the stone floor, a respectful distance away. I brought your meal. He stared at the tray for a long moment without moving, his jaw tight, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. I do not want it. Why not? Every time I eat, he said slowly, each word seeming to cost him effort, it grows worse afterward. The anger. The hunger to hurt something. I have learned to fear my own meals more than I fear starvation. Ren's pulse quickened, though she kept her face calm. This confirmed what she had suspected since speaking with Mira that morning. How long has this been happening? Years, he said. I do not remember when it started. I remember being different, once, before. Before what? His claws dug faintly into the stone floor, an unconscious gesture of distress. Before I became this. Ren studied him carefully, cataloging every detail with the trained eye of a healer. The trembling in his hands that came and went in waves, the way his pupils seemed to swallow the amber around them when his voice grew strained, the scars along his arms that looked less like wounds from battle and more like the marks a person left on themselves trying to hold back something overwhelming. "May I ask you something that might sound strange?" she said. He gave the faintest nod. "When the anger comes, does it feel like it belongs to you, or does it feel like something separate, something pushing in from outside?" For the first time since she had met him, real surprise crossed his features, breaking through the wall of wildness that seemed to guard every other expression. "No one has ever asked me that." "Which is it?" she pressed gently. He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question as though turning over a stone to see what lived beneath it. "Outside," he finally said. "It has always felt like something outside, like a fire that is not mine, burning through me anyway." Ren nodded slowly, her mind already racing through possibilities, comparing his description against every illness and affliction she had studied during her years as a healer. Madness born from grief or trauma tended to feel deeply personal, deeply rooted in the person's own mind and memory. What he described sounded different. It sounded like poison, like something introduced to the body that did not belong there, hijacking the mind and turning it against itself. "I would like to test something," she said carefully. "Nothing that will hurt you. I only wish to look more closely at your food, if you will allow it." "Why would you bother?" he asked, something raw and unguarded in his voice now. "Why does a stranger care what happens to a beast the whole kingdom fears?" Ren met his eyes then, just for a moment, breaking the very rule Callum had warned her against, because some truths needed to be spoken directly. "Because I do not believe you are a beast. I believe something has been done to you, and I intend to find out what." The amber glow in his eyes flickered, and for the second time since she had arrived at the fortress, Ren saw the storm inside him part just slightly, revealing something quieter and more human underneath. He did not answer with words. He only watched her, silent and searching, as though trying to determine whether hope was something he could still afford to feel. Outside the chamber, unseen by either of them, a shadow lingered near the top of the staircase a moment longer than necessary, before moving quietly away, footsteps fading into the depths of the fortress, like something that did not wish to be noticed at all. Ren returned to the kitchens with the untouched tray, her mind already forming a plan. She waited until Mira stepped away to tend the ovens, then carefully wrapped small portions of the bread, meat, and wine in cloth, tucking them into the pocket of her apron. She would need privacy and time to examine them properly, and neither was easy to find in a fortress full of watchful eyes. That evening, alone in her small room, she spread the samples across a cloth on her narrow table and lit a second candle for better light. Years of training had taught her to recognize the common poisons, the ones that caused sickness of the stomach, or slowed the heart, or brought on fevers. But what she tested for now was different, something slower and more insidious, the kind of substance that did not kill quickly, but instead reshaped a person from the inside, turning reason into rage over months and years rather than hours. She crushed a small piece of the bread between her fingers and held it close to the candle flame, watching the way the crumbs caught the light. Then she touched a fragment to her tongue, careful to use only the smallest amount, testing for the particular bitterness that certain rare toxins left behind, a bitterness that faded quickly but never fully disappeared if a person knew to look for it. There. Faint but unmistakable to someone trained to notice it, a bitterness beneath the taste of the grain, subtle enough to be missed by anyone who was not specifically searching for it. She turned to the wine next, pouring a small amount into a cup and holding it up to the candlelight. The liquid looked ordinary, deep red and clear, but when she tilted it slowly, she noticed the faintest film clinging to the inside of the cup, a residue that proper wine did not leave behind. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the cup down. She had read about a substance like this once, years ago, in an old healer's journal passed down from a teacher who had traveled far beyond her village. The journal spoke of a rare root, grown only in certain shadowed valleys, ground into powder, and used by those who wished to slowly unmake a person's mind, without ever being suspected of violence. Given in small enough doses over long enough time, it mimicked the symptoms of an inherited curse almost perfectly. The victim's own body would seem to betray them, their own blood appearing to turn against their sanity, while the true cause remained hidden in something as innocent as bread and wine. Ren sat back against the wall of her small room, her heart pounding with the weight of what she had discovered. Someone within this fortress had been poisoning the king for years, disguising an assassination as fate, patient enough to let the substance do its slow work rather than risk the suspicion that came with sudden violence. But why? Who would benefit from a king who seemed cursed rather than dead? A king who could be locked away, feared and pitied in equal measure, his throne effectively empty while he still drew breath. The answer came to her almost immediately, cold and clear. Someone who could not simply kill the king without raising immediate suspicion, but who stood to gain everything if the king was declared unfit to rule. Someone patient enough to wait years for that outcome, comfortable enough within the fortress walls to control what reached the king's table, meal after meal, year after year. She thought of the members of the council she had glimpsed since arriving, the advisors who moved through the fortress with quiet authority, and felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the cold night air. She would need proof before she spoke a single word of her suspicions aloud. An accusation without evidence would only endanger her further, especially if the poisoner already occupied a position of power within these walls. For now, she would need to move carefully, gathering what she could while continuing her visits to the king's chamber, building whatever trust might be possible between herself and the man everyone else had already given up on saving. She spent the following days establishing a careful routine. Each morning, she helped Mira in the kitchens, watching closely as meals were prepared, memorizing faces and movements, searching for any moment where someone might slip something extra into the food meant for the king's tray. Each midday and evening, she carried the tray up the long staircase herself, sitting with Draven while he ate, or more often did not eat, watching his reactions with the careful eye of someone cataloging symptoms rather than simply making conversation. Slowly, cautiously, something began to shift between them. On the third day, she brought a small portion of food she had prepared herself, using ingredients she had personally selected and watched from source to plate, ensuring nothing could have been tampered with along the way. She offered it to him with the same calm patience she had shown from the very first night. "This is different," she said. "I made this myself, this morning, with my own hands. Nothing has touched it that I did not touch first." Draven regarded the offering with obvious suspicion, the same wariness she had come to recognize in him, but something in her steady gaze seemed to reach him. Slowly, he took the offered bread and ate it, his movements careful and deliberate, as though testing whether his own body would betray him even now. An hour passed, then two. Ren stayed with him the entire time, watching closely for any sign of the rage that usually followed his meals, the trembling and the wild look that crept into his eyes whenever the poison took hold. It never came. "You are not angry," she said softly, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. Draven looked down at his own hands, turning them over slowly, as though seeing them clearly for the first time in longer than he could remember. "No," he said, his voice rough, with something that sounded almost like disbelief. "I am not. I believe I understand what has been happening to you," Ren said carefully. "I believe someone has been poisoning your food for a very long time, using something rare enough that no one thought to search for it. Something that mimics madness so well that everyone, including you, believed the curse in your blood had simply grown worse with age." Draven's head snapped up, his amber eyes locking onto hers, with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You believe I am not cursed? I believe you have been poisoned," Ren said firmly. "There is a difference, and it is a difference that can be undone." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Draven stared at her, as though she had offered him something he had not dared to hope for in longer than he could remember, something more precious than freedom, or even sanity, hope. "If you are right," he said slowly, "then someone within these walls has spent years trying to destroy me from the inside, patient enough to wait for my own mind to condemn me before anyone else could." "Yes," Ren said quietly. "Then we are both in danger, the moment they learn what you suspect." "I know," she answered, and found, to her own surprise, that the knowledge did not frighten her nearly as much as it should have. She had come to this fortress, prepared to give her life for peace between two warring kingdoms. She had not expected to find, chained in darkness, a man worth saving, for reasons that had nothing to do with treaties or politics at all. Outside the chamber door, Footsteps paused once again near the top of the staircase, lingering just long enough to catch the tail end of their conversation, before retreating quietly into the shadows of the fortress, carrying word of what had been overheard, to ears that would not welcome the news at all. Ren barely slept that night. Her mind turned over every detail of the toxin she had identified, searching her memory for anything her old teacher had written about reversing its effects. The journal she remembered had spoken only briefly of a cure, a rare flowering plant that grew in high, rocky places, its petals ground into a paste that could counter the poison's grip on the mind when applied correctly. She had seen the plant once before, years ago, growing along a cliffside near her village, its pale blue petals unmistakable against the gray stone. She did not know if such a plant grew anywhere near the fortress, but she resolved to search for it regardless. The following morning, she requested permission from Callum to walk the fortress grounds, claiming she needed fresh air and a chance to gather herbs for her healing work. He granted it readily enough, perhaps relieved to see her occupied with something other than the king's chamber for a few hours. She walked the rocky hillsides surrounding the fortress for most of the morning, her eyes searching every crevice and shadowed ledge for a flash of pale blue among the gray stone. Just as she began to lose hope, she spotted it, a small cluster of flowers growing stubbornly from a crack in the rock face near the northern wall, exactly as she remembered from her childhood. She gathered as much as she dared without stripping the plant bare, carrying the fragile petals back to her room, wrapped carefully in a damp cloth. That evening, she ground them slowly into a fine paste, mixing in a few other herbs she had brought from her village for exactly this kind of purpose, testing the mixture carefully against her own skin first, to ensure it caused no harm. Before trusting the paste enough to consider using it on Draven, Ren spent an additional day testing its safety as thoroughly as her limited resources allowed. She applied a small amount to her own skin first, watching carefully for any sign of irritation or adverse reaction, waiting through a full day and night before concluding the mixture caused no harm on its own. She then tested a slightly larger amount on herself, monitoring her own heartbeat and breathing with the careful attention she had once used to teach apprentice healers back in her village, ensuring the cure carried no hidden danger of its own that might compound whatever damage the poison had already caused. She also found a small stray cat that wandered the fortress kitchens seeking scraps, and with Mira's reluctant permission, offered the animal a tiny portion of food laced with an equally tiny amount of the paste, watching closely over the following hours to confirm the creature showed no signs of distress. The cat, unbothered by the experiment, simply curled up near the hearth and slept soundly through the afternoon, offering Ren the reassurance she needed that the cure itself posed no danger beyond whatever risk came from the manner of its delivery. Only once she felt fully confident in the paste's safety did she allow herself to consider the more difficult question of how such a delicate cure might reach a man whose instincts remained sharp enough to sense danger in nearly everything placed before him. The difficulty, she realized as she worked, would not be making the cure. It would be delivering it. Draven had already grown suspicious of anything placed on a tray, anything that arrived through the usual channels of food and drink. If the poisoner learned that Ren had identified a cure and attempted to smuggle it to him through his meals, they would surely find some way to intercept it or discredit her before it could take effect. She needed another way, something that would not raise suspicion, something direct enough that no one could tamper with it along the way. The answer came to her slowly, uncomfortably, as she stared at the small paste she had created. It would need to enter his body quickly and directly, absorbed through the delicate skin of the lips and mouth, rather than swallowed and processed slowly through the stomach, where its effects might be too gradual to counter the poison's grip, during a moment when he was already lucid enough to accept her help. She thought of the risk immediately. Draven's control over his own instincts was fragile at best, his feral nature always simmering just beneath the surface, ready to lash out if he felt threatened or cornered. To approach him so closely, so intimately, carried real danger. But she thought also of the flickers of clarity she had witnessed in him already, the moments where the man beneath the beast had reached toward her, cautious and searching. She believed, with a certainty she could not fully explain, that he would not hurt her. She thought of the risk immediately. Draven's control over his own instincts was fragile at best, his feral nature always simmering just beneath the surface, ready to lash out if he felt threatened or cornered. To approach him so closely, so intimately, carried real danger. But she thought also of the flickers of clarity she had witnessed in him already, the moments where the man beneath the beast had reached toward her, cautious and searching. She believed, with a certainty she could not fully explain, that he would not hurt her. She spent that final night before her attempt, lying awake in her small room, staring at the shadows cast across the ceiling by her single candle, turning the decision over again and again in her mind. She thought of her mother, back in her village, who had begged her not to volunteer for this very fortress, certain her daughter would not survive the encounter. She thought of Bram, who had taught her that a healer's first duty was to do no harm, even to herself, and wondered whether what she planned honored that teaching, or defied it entirely. Yet beneath every doubt, one certainty remained steady and unshaken. She had looked into Draven's eyes during their quiet conversations these past days, and had seen, clearly now, a man desperate to be saved from a cruelty inflicted upon him without his consent. Whatever risk the moment carried, she found she trusted him more than she feared the danger, a realization that surprised her with its own quiet strength. She rose before dawn, unable to sleep further, and spent the early morning hours preparing the paste one final time, ensuring its consistency and potency were as strong as she could make them, without risking harm. By the time the sun crested the eastern hills, she felt as ready as she would ever be for what the day demanded of her. She prepared carefully that morning, coating her lips with the smallest necessary amount of the paste she had made, testing it first to ensure it left no strange taste or color that might alarm him. She dressed in the same plain wool she always wore, tied her hair back, and made her way up the long staircase toward his chamber, with her heart pounding harder than it had on that very first night. Callum let her through without question, having grown accustomed to her visits by now, though something in her expression must have betrayed her nervousness, because he studied her closely before opening the door. "Are you certain about this?" he asked quietly. "Whatever it is you are planning." "I am certain it needs to be done," Ren answered. "Whether I am certain of my own safety is a different question entirely." Callum said nothing further, only opened the door and let her pass through into the dim chamber beyond. Draven was sitting up against the far wall when she entered, more alert than she had seen him in days, his amber eyes tracking her movement with obvious curiosity. The lucid moments had been coming more frequently since she began preparing his food herself. Small windows, where the storm inside him quieted enough for real conversation to pass between them. "You look troubled," he observed, his voice steadier than it had been on their first meeting. "I have found something that may help you," Ren said, kneeling beside him at a distance that had grown smaller with each visit, no longer needing to keep the careful separation of their first encounters. "A cure for what has been done to you, but it needs to reach you directly, quickly, in a way that cannot be intercepted or tampered with." Draven watched her carefully, understanding dawning slowly in his expression as she moved closer, close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold scattered through the amber of his eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool chamber. "What do you intend to do?" he asked, his voice quieter now, careful. "Trust me, my king," Ren whispered, and closed the last small distance between them, pressing her lips gently to his. For one terrible, endless moment, she felt him go rigid beneath her touch, felt the tension coiled through his entire body, like a spring pulled taut, ready to snap in either direction. She held herself still, refusing to pull away, despite every instinct screaming at her to retreat, trusting the man she had glimpsed in those brief windows of clarity, to recognize her intention, rather than react with the wildness that lived so close to the surface of him. Slowly, impossibly, the tension began to ease. His breathing, which had gone sharp and ragged, steadied gradually beneath her touch. When she finally drew back, just enough to look into his eyes, she found the amber glow had softened. The wildness receded further than she had ever seen it, leaving behind something clearer and more human than she had dared to hope for. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, one hand rising slowly to touch his own lips, as though checking that what had just happened was real. "I gave you the cure, the only way I knew would work," Ren said, her own voice unsteady now that the moment had passed, the full weight of what she had just done settling over her. "I am sorry I did not explain first. I feared that if I did, you might refuse out of concern for my safety, rather than your own healing." "You were right to fear that," Draven admitted, something almost like a laugh, rough and unpracticed, escaping him. I would have refused. I would rather live as a beast forever than risk harming you. Then it is fortunate I did not ask, Ren said, and found herself smiling, despite the exhaustion and fear still coursing through her. They sat together in silence for a long while after that, the chamber feeling less like a prison and more like simply a room, two people finding their way towards something neither of them had expected to find in a place built for chains and darkness. Draven's hands, when Ren finally glanced at them, had stopped trembling entirely, steadier than she had seen them since her arrival at the fortress. I remember my father, Draven said suddenly, breaking the quiet that had settled between them, his voice distant, as though reaching for something long buried beneath years of fog and rage. Before all of this, he used to take me riding along the northern ridge when I was young, before dawn, so we could watch the sun rise over the valley together. He told me once that a king's strength was not measured by how loudly he could roar, but by how steadily he could stand when everything around him wished to see him fall. He sounds like he loved you very much, Ren said softly. He did, Draven agreed, something raw moving behind his eyes. He died suddenly, a fever that took him within a matter of days, faster than anyone expected. I was barely prepared to take the crown, let alone rule a kingdom still recovering from years of border conflict. I remember feeling afraid, in those early days, that I would fail him, fail everyone who depended on me. And then the poisoning began, Ren said quietly, understanding now with painful clarity how perfectly Edmund had chosen his moment, striking while Draven was still young and uncertain, still grieving a father he had lost too soon, still vulnerable in ways that made the slow creep of poison easy to disguise as simple grief or the burden of unexpected rule. I did not even notice at first, Draven admitted. I told myself the anger was grief. Then I told myself it was the weight of the crown. By the time I understood something was truly wrong, I could no longer trust my own mind enough to determine what was real, and what the poison had invented within me. I began to fear myself more than I feared any enemy beyond these walls. Ren reached out then, resting her hand gently over his, an act of comfort rather than healing this time. Your father would be proud of the man sitting before me now, she said, not because you never fell, but because you found your way back up despite everything that conspired to keep you down. Draven turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together with a gentleness that seemed almost foreign to hands that had spent so many years curled into claws against stone walls. I do not know if I would have found my way back at all, were it not for you. You would have, Ren said, with a certainty she felt down to her very bones. I only helped you see the path more clearly. The strength to walk it was always yours. How long will this last? He asked eventually. The clarity. Will it fade again, once the poison finds its way back into me? I do not know, Ren admitted honestly. The cure I have given you may only slow the effects temporarily, especially if you continue receiving the poison through your regular meals. We will need to stop the source entirely if you are to heal fully. Then we must find who is responsible, Draven said, and for the first time since she had met him, his voice carried the weight and authority of a king, rather than the desperation of a caged animal. Whoever has done this to me will answer for it. Ren nodded, feeling a flicker of hope kindle in her chest, alongside the fear that still lingered from what she had just risked. They had taken the first real step toward reclaiming his mind. Now came the harder task of reclaiming his throne, and finding, among the shadows of his own court, the person patient enough and cruel enough to have poisoned a king for years without ever being suspected. Neither of them noticed, in the quiet aftermath of that moment, the faint sound of a door easing shut somewhere down the corridor, footsteps retreating swiftly into the depths of the fortress, carrying news of what had just been witnessed to someone who would not welcome it at all. The days that followed brought changes that seemed almost too good to be believed. Draven's lucid moments grew longer, stretching from mere minutes into entire hours, then into most of a day at a time. Ren continued preparing his meals herself, watching closely for any sign that the poison still lingered in his system, applying small amounts of the cure whenever his eyes began to lose their focus, or his hands began to tremble with the old familiar warning signs. Alongside the physical cure, Ren began teaching Draven small exercises, meant to help him regain a sense of control over his own instincts, techniques she had learned from Bram years earlier, for calming patients whose minds had been shaken loose by fever or grief. She taught him to breathe slowly and deliberately whenever he felt the old anger stirring, counting each breath carefully until the immediate surge of feeling passed. "It will not undo the years of damage in a single afternoon," she told him, as they practiced together in his chamber one quiet morning. "But it will give your mind something steady to hold on to, a small anchor against whatever storm still lingers within you." Draven followed her instruction dutifully, closing his eyes and drawing slow, measured breaths as she guided him, though he could not fully suppress a rueful smile at the strangeness of the exercise. "I feel foolish," he admitted, a king of these lands, sitting quietly and counting his own breathing like a child. "There is no foolishness in healing," Ren said firmly, "only in refusing to try methods simply because they seem beneath one's dignity. I have seen hardened soldiers weep during these same exercises, and found themselves stronger for having done so." Over the following days, Draven practiced diligently, finding that the technique did indeed offer him a measure of control he had not possessed since long before his affliction began. When frustration rose during council discussions, or when memories of his lost years threatened to overwhelm him with grief or anger, he found himself instinctively drawing slow breaths, steadying his mind before responding, a habit that soon became so natural that few among his court even noticed the small ritual taking place. Not every day of that recovery passed smoothly. Nearly a week after the cure had first taken hold, Ren arrived at Draven's chamber one morning to find him crouched low against the far wall, exactly as he had been on that very first night, his shoulders shaking, his breathing ragged and uneven. Her heart lurched with fear as she hurried to his side, careful but urgent. "Draven, what happened?" "I do not know," he ground out, his voice strained, his hands curling against the stone floor, as though fighting to hold back something clawing its way to the surface. "I woke feeling as I used to, the anger rising before I could even understand why. I feared I had imagined the last week entirely, that none of it was real." Ren's mind raced, searching for an explanation. She had brought his meals herself every day since discovering the poison, testing each portion carefully before it ever reached him, certain nothing tainted could have slipped through her watch. Unless the poison itself, having built up in his body over so many years, still lingered somewhere within him, resurfacing now and then, even without a fresh dose to sustain it. "It is the old poison working its way out of your body," she said slowly, understanding dawning even as she spoke the words aloud. "Something this deeply rooted would not release its hold all at once. There may be days, even weeks, where the effects return briefly, before fading again for good." "Then I am not free of it," Draven said, something like despair cracking through his voice, a sound Ren had not heard from him since those very first nights of chains and fear. "You are healing," Ren corrected firmly, kneeling beside him and taking his trembling hands in her own, refusing to let him retreat into the hopelessness that had defined so much of his existence before her arrival. "Healing is rarely a straight path. It comes in waves, some days stronger than others, but the direction remains the same, even when it does not feel that way." She stayed with him through the worst of that morning, applying a fresh application of the cure she had prepared, speaking to him steadily and calmly, until the shaking in his hands eased, and the wildness in his eyes receded once more. By midday, the clarity had returned fully, though the fear of its fragility lingered between them for the rest of that day, a quiet reminder that trust, once broken by years of betrayal, could not be expected to heal without setbacks along the way. "I was afraid," Draven admitted later, once the worst had passed, "that I would frighten you away, that you would see how easily the beast still lives beneath the surface and decide I was not worth the risk of staying." "I have already seen the beast," Ren said gently. "I saw it on the very first night we met, chained and starving, and furious with a world that had wronged it terribly. I did not leave then, and I do not intend to leave now, simply because healing takes longer than either of us might wish." Draven studied her for a long moment, something fierce and grateful moving behind his amber eyes. "I do not deserve such patience." "Perhaps not," Ren said, a small smile touching her lips, despite the weight of the morning they had just endured together. "But you have it regardless. Some things are given freely, not because they are deserved, but because they are needed." Callum was the first to notice the change beyond the chamber door. He had served the fortress for over a decade, long enough to remember the young Prince Draven had once been, before whatever affliction took hold of him and turned the court against its own future king. When Draven spoke to him directly one morning, calm and coherent, asking after the state of the fortress guard and the condition of the outer walls, Callum nearly dropped the tray he carried in surprise. "My king," he said, kneeling immediately, his voice thick with an emotion he clearly had not expected to feel again. "It is good to hear you speak with such clarity." "Do not kneel to me yet, old friend," Draven said, though something in his tone had warmed considerably from the rough growl Ren remembered from their first meeting. "There is still work to be done before I can call myself fit to rule again." Emboldened by his growing clarity, Draven requested a private meeting with his uncle a few days later, curious to test how Edmund would react to his nephew's improving condition, and cautious about revealing too much of his recovery before Ren had gathered sufficient proof of the poisoning. Edmund arrived at the meeting with his usual composed warmth, though Ren, watching from a discreet distance at Draven's request, noticed a flicker of unease cross the older man's face when he saw how steady and alert his nephew appeared. "You seem improved, nephew," Edmund said carefully, settling into a chair across from Draven's own seat near the hearth. "The council will be pleased to hear it, though I confess some surprise at how quickly this change has come upon you." "Healing arrives unpredictably, uncle," Draven replied evenly, careful to reveal no more than a king slowly, naturally recovering might reveal. "I find myself grateful for whatever has eased my mind these past weeks, though I cannot say with certainty what has caused the improvement." "Grateful indeed," Edmund said, though something guarded had entered his voice now, his eyes flicking briefly toward the door, as though calculating how much longer he might need to maintain his composure. "You must rest and recover fully before taking on the burdens of rule once more. I am, of course, glad to continue managing the kingdom's affairs until you feel entirely restored." "Of course," Draven said, matching his uncle's careful tone precisely, giving nothing away of the suspicion already forming behind his calm expression. "Your guidance these past years has been invaluable, uncle. I do not know how the kingdom would have fared without your steady hand." The words, spoken with careful neutrality, seemed to ease some of Edmund's visible tension, and the meeting concluded shortly afterward, with no outward sign that either man suspected the other of anything beyond ordinary family concern. Only once Edmund had departed did Draven turn to Ren, his expression hardening considerably. "He is afraid," Draven said quietly. "I saw it clearly, beneath all his careful composure. A man confident in his own innocence does not grow uneasy at the sight of improving health in someone he claims to love." "Then we must move quickly," Ren said, "before that fear convinces him to take more drastic action, to protect whatever secret he is guarding so carefully." Beyond the fortress walls, in the market town that sprawled along the base of the northern hills, rumors of the king's changing condition traveled faster than anyone within the fortress realized. Merchants who delivered goods to the kitchens carried whispers back to their stalls, and soon the entire town buzzed with speculation about what might be happening behind those ancient stone walls. An old grain merchant named Osric, who had supplied the fortress kitchens for over 20 years, found himself cornered one afternoon by a cluster of curious townsfolk, eager for any scrap of information he might carry from his most recent delivery. "Is it true," one woman asked, clutching her market basket nervously, "that the feral king has been seen walking the fortress grounds without chains?" "I saw him myself, from a distance," Osric said, lowering his voice as though sharing a great secret, though half the market had already gathered close enough to hear. Standing tall as any proper king ought to stand, speaking calmly with his guard captain. Nothing feral about him that I could see. "They say a healer did it," another voice chimed in. "An Omega, sent as part of the peace treaty, who found some way to cure whatever curse had held him for so many years." "Cure or no cure," an older man grumbled skeptically, "I will believe it fully, when the war truly ends, and the soldiers stop patrolling our roads at all hours." His skepticism, though understandable after years of hardship, would not last much longer. Within days, official word arrived from the fortress itself, carried by royal messengers to every town and village within the kingdom's borders, confirming that King Draven Ashbourne had recovered his full faculties and intended to resume direct governance of the realm. The announcement spoke also of ongoing negotiations to formally end hostilities with the neighboring kingdom, negotiations that would soon bear fruit in the form of withdrawn soldiers and reopened trade routes. The market town celebrated that evening with an impromptu gathering, musicians appearing seemingly from nowhere to fill the square with music, the mood lighter than it had been in years. Osric, raising a cup of ale among his neighbors, found himself toasting to a king he had never expected to see restored, and to whatever mysterious healer had accomplished what an entire kingdom's physicians had failed to achieve across so many long years. Word of these celebrations eventually reached Ren through Mira, who relayed the stories with obvious delight at how quickly hope had spread beyond the fortress walls, once given the smallest reason to take root. Ren found herself deeply moved by the news, understanding for the first time the full scope of what she and Draven had accomplished together, not merely the recovery of one man, but the restoration of hope for an entire kingdom that had spent years bracing against continued suffering. Draven chose to make his first public appearance, not before the full council, but before the fortress guard, the soldiers who had stood watch over his chamber for years, who had grown so accustomed to fear and dread whenever their duty rotated toward the northern corridor. He gathered them in the training yard one crisp morning, standing before them without chains or guards of his own, dressed simply, his bearing calm and steady, in a way none of the younger soldiers had ever witnessed from their king. "Many of you have known me only as a threat to be contained," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled ranks. "A danger locked away for your own safety, a burden your captains warned you to approach with caution and dread. I will not pretend those years did not happen, or that the fear you carried was unwarranted given what I had become, but I stand before you today in full possession of my mind, and I intend to earn back, through my actions rather than my words alone, whatever trust those years cost this fortress." A murmur rippled through the ranks, uncertain but not hostile, the soldiers exchanging glances as their king continued speaking, with a clarity and warmth few had thought possible from the creature they remembered pacing behind iron chains. "I know some among you lost comrades or family. During the years my illness left this kingdom vulnerable, when soldiers were spread thin, defending borders my own weakness, invited enemies to test," Draven continued. "I cannot undo those losses, but I can promise you a king who will not again allow such vulnerability to take root, who will govern with the clarity my father once showed, and who owes that clarity to a healer brave enough to see past the fear that gripped this entire fortress for far too long." One of the younger soldiers, a boy barely past his first year of service, stepped forward hesitantly from the ranks. "My king, is it true the healer risked her own life to bring you back to yourself?" "It is true," Draven said, something warm entering his voice at the memory. "She knelt before me in chains and darkness, when every soul in this fortress believed she would not survive the encounter, and she never once wavered in her conviction that I was worth saving. I owe her a debt I do not believe I can ever fully repay." The soldiers exchanged glances again, this time carrying something closer to genuine respect than mere uncertainty, and by the time Draven dismissed the assembly, a current of renewed loyalty had begun to spread through the ranks, carried forward in the same manner. Rumors of fear had once spread through those same corridors during the darkest years of his affliction. Word of the king's improvement spread slowly through the fortress, carried in whispers among the servants and guards who had grown so accustomed to fearing the chamber at the end of the northern corridor. Not everyone received the news with joy. Ren noticed the change in how certain members of the council looked at her when she passed through the fortress halls, their expressions shifting from indifference to something sharper, more calculating. She mentioned this to Draven during one of their long conversations, sitting together in his chamber, as the last of his chains, unlocked now that his control had returned enough to warrant such trust, lay coiled and unused against the wall. "The council will not welcome my recovery," Draven said grimly, confirming her suspicions. "Certain members have grown comfortable with my absence from true rule. My uncle Edmund has served as regent for these last several years, managing the kingdom's affairs in my name, while I remained locked away, unfit to govern." "Your uncle," Ren repeated slowly, a chill settling over her. "He would benefit most from your continued illness." "He would," Draven agreed, his expression darkening. "Though I have always believed his loyalty to me was genuine, despite the years he has spent effectively ruling in my place. I do not wish to accuse him without cause." "We will need proof," Ren said, echoing the thought that had lived in the back of her mind since first identifying the poison in his food. "Proof strong enough that no one can dismiss it, no matter how much power the guilty party holds within these walls." They began their investigation carefully, using the trust Ren had built within the kitchens over the previous weeks. She spoke quietly with Mira, asking careful questions about who had access to the ingredients used in the king's meals, who oversaw the delivery of the wine casks from the cellars, who had insisted, years ago, that the king's food be prepared separately from the rest of the fortress kitchen. Mira's answers, given hesitantly at first, and then with growing conviction, as she realized the implications of her own knowledge, painted a troubling picture. The separate preparation of the king's meals had been established shortly after Draven's affliction first began, ordered by the council, under the reasoning that his condition required special dietary care. The order had come specifically from Edmund, who had personally selected the servant responsible for preparing the tray each day, a quiet man named Aldrich who kept mostly to himself, and answered to no one but the regent directly. "I always found it strange," Mira admitted, wringing her hands nervously as she spoke. "Aldrich never let anyone else near the king's tray, not even to help carry it up the stairs. I assumed it was simply his way, keeping to himself. I never imagined there might be a darker reason." Ren carried this information back to Draven that evening, watching his expression harden as she laid out what she had learned. "Aldrich has served my uncle for many years," Draven said slowly, "long before I fell ill. If he has been the one adding poison to my meals, he would not have acted alone. Someone gave the order, someone provided the poison itself." "We need to speak with him," Ren said, carefully. "If he suspects we know the truth before we have proof strong enough to act, he may flee, or worse, warn whoever gave him his instructions." They devised a plan over the following days, one that required patience and careful timing. Ren would continue her usual routine, preparing the king's meals herself as she had for weeks now, while quietly observing Aldrich's movements whenever their paths crossed within the fortress kitchens. Draven, meanwhile, began cautiously reasserting his presence among the guard and remaining household staff, testing the waters of his own authority, without yet revealing the full extent of his recovery to the council. The tension of those days weighed heavily on Ren, a constant awareness that every conversation, every glance exchanged with Mira or the guards, might be observed by eyes loyal to Edmund. She found herself sleeping poorly, waking at every unfamiliar sound within the fortress walls, her healer's instincts for danger sharpened by weeks of careful investigation into something far more dangerous than any illness she had treated before. It was during one of these sleepless nights that she finally caught sight of Aldrich alone, moving quietly through the kitchen storeroom well after the rest of the staff had retired for the evening. She watched from the shadows of the doorway as he carefully measured a small amount of dark powder from a hidden pouch into a leather satchel, mixing it with practiced ease before tucking the satchel away among the ordinary kitchen supplies. Her heart pounded as she withdrew silently, careful not to alert him to her presence. She had found what she needed. Proof, at last, that the poisoning was deliberate and ongoing, carried out by a man who moved through these halls with the quiet confidence of someone who believed himself entirely safe from suspicion. She brought word to Draven at first light, her exhaustion forgotten in the urgency of what she had witnessed. "I saw him," she said, breathless from hurrying through the corridors. "Aldrich, preparing the poison himself, just last night. If we can catch him with the substance in hand, before your council, there will be no room left for doubt or denial." Draven's expression, when she finished speaking, carried a weight of determination she had not seen in him before. The bearing of a king, preparing to reclaim what had been stolen from him through years of patient cruelty. "Then we will catch him," he said, "and we will learn, once and for all, whose hand truly guided the poison meant to destroy me." But even as they made their plans that morning, neither of them noticed the quiet figure watching from the far end of the corridor, nor understood how quickly word of their discovery would travel to ears that had grown desperate to protect a secret worth killing to preserve. Before the trap could be set, Ren nearly lost everything in a single careless moment. 2 days after she witnessed Aldrich mixing the poison in the storeroom, she returned there in daylight, hoping to find some additional trace of the substance to strengthen the case they were building. She had believed the storeroom empty, its usual occupant busy elsewhere in the fortress, and so she moved without her usual caution, running her fingers along the shelves where she had seen him working, searching for any leftover trace of the dark powder. She did not hear the door open behind her. "Looking for something?" Ren spun around, her heart lurching painfully, to find Aldrich standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, a basket of onions balanced against his hip, as though he had simply come to fetch supplies for the evening meal. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them spoke, and Ren was acutely aware of how close she stood to the very shelf where she had watched him measure poison into a leather satchel only 2 nights before. "I was looking for dried mint," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the panic hammering through her chest. "For a tea, to help with the king's sleep." Aldrich's eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary, flicking briefly toward the shelf she had been examining before returning to her face. "Mint is kept on the shelf nearer the door," he said finally. "That one holds spices we rarely use." "Thank you," Wren said, moving past him with what she hoped looked like unhurried calm, though every nerve in her body screamed at her to run. She retrieved a handful of dried mint from the correct shelf, nodded politely to Aldrich, and walked out of the storeroom at a measured pace, forcing herself not to break into a run until she had turned the corner into the next corridor. Only then did she allow herself to lean against the cold stone wall, breathing hard, her hands trembling with the aftermath of how close she had come to revealing herself too soon. If Aldrich suspected she had been searching for evidence against him, he might warn Edmund immediately, giving the regent time to destroy whatever remained of the poison, or worse, to move against Wren and Draven before their own plan could be set into motion. She found Draven that evening in his chamber, still cautious about how much freedom he allowed himself beyond its walls even as his control continued to strengthen, and told him what had happened. "You should not have gone there alone," he said, his voice tight with concern rather than anger, though the amber in his eyes had darkened slightly with the effort of containing his reaction. "I know," Wren admitted. "I grew careless, believing myself safer than I truly was. It will not happen again." "We move forward tomorrow then," Draven said, his jaw set with new determination. "Before Aldrich has time to grow suspicious enough to warn my uncle. We cannot afford further delay." It was this decision, made in the aftermath of Wren's narrow escape, that set the trap into motion the following evening, the very trap that would ultimately expose Edmund's years of careful betrayal, though neither of them yet knew how swiftly and viciously the regent would turn Wren's own discovery against her, once he realized his secret could no longer be contained. That same night, before the trap could even be arranged, danger arrived from a direction neither Wren nor Draven had anticipated. Word had apparently already reached one of Edmund's most trusted men, a soldier named Garrick who had served the regent personally for years, that something was being investigated within the kitchen storeroom. Rather than wait to learn the full extent of what had been discovered, Garrick decided to act on his own initiative, believing he could silence the threat before it grew any larger. Wren was walking alone through the fortress corridor toward her small room that night, her thoughts still occupied with the plan for tomorrow's evening, when a figure stepped suddenly from the shadows of an alcove ahead of her, blocking her path entirely. "You should not have come here," Garrick said, his voice low and threatening, one hand resting meaningfully on the hilt of the blade at his belt. "Whatever you think you have discovered, it would be wise to forget it, and forget it quickly, before someone decides your presence within these walls has become far too costly to tolerate." Wren's heart pounded, but years of training as a healer, of remaining calm in the face of injury and crisis, steadied her voice, despite the fear coursing through her. "I do not know what you believe I have discovered," she said carefully, "but threatening me will only draw more attention to whatever it is you wish to remain hidden." Garrick took a step closer, his expression hardening. "I am not here to debate with you, healer. I am here to ensure certain matters remain buried." Before he could take another step, a familiar voice rang out sharply from the far end of the corridor. "Step away from her." Callum emerged from the shadows, his own blade already drawn, his expression carrying none of the uncertainty that had marked his earlier interactions with Wren during her first days at the fortress. He had grown to trust her over the preceding weeks, had watched closely as the king's condition improved under her care, and he was not about to allow anyone to harm her now, regardless of whose orders they claimed to follow. Garrick hesitated, clearly weighing his chances against a guard captain armed and alert, before deciding the risk was not worth whatever reward his loyalty to Edmund might have promised him. He backed away slowly, disappearing back into the shadows of the fortress with a final, warning glance toward Wren, before he vanished entirely. "Are you harmed?" Callum asked, sheathing his blade and hurrying to her side. "No," Wren said, though her hands trembled now that the danger had passed, the adrenaline of the encounter finally catching up with her. "Only shaken. Thank you, Callum. I do not know what would have happened had you not arrived when you did. I have been watching more closely since you began investigating the kitchen storeroom," Callum admitted. "I suspected something like this might happen, once word of your suspicions began to spread beyond those who needed to know." They reported the encounter to Draven immediately, and his expression darkened considerably upon hearing how close Ren had come to real harm within his own fortress walls. "This confirms what we suspected," he said grimly. "Edmund already knows we are close to uncovering the truth. We cannot afford to wait any longer. The trap must be sprung tomorrow, before he has time to arrange anything further." The trap was set for the following evening. Draven, with Callum's help, arranged for 2 trusted guards to hide within the storeroom before Aldrich's usual hour of preparation, ready to witness and confirm what Ren had already seen with her own eyes. Ren herself would wait nearby, prepared to identify the substance for what it truly was the moment it was found. Everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan until the moment Ren stepped into the kitchen corridor that evening and found Mira waiting for her, face pale and drawn with worry. "You must leave," Mira whispered urgently, pulling her aside into a shadowed alcove. "Now, before the guards arrive. Edmund knows. I do not know how, but he knows what you suspect, and he has already moved against you." Ren's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "He has told the council you are a spy," Mira said, her hands trembling as she spoke. "Sent from the conquered territories to assassinate the king using poison, disguising your crime as an act of healing. He has claimed the substance found in the kitchen storeroom, whatever it may be, was planted there by your own hand to frame an innocent servant." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Ren understood immediately the cunning of the move. Edmund had turned her own discovery against her, twisting proof of his own guilt into evidence of her supposed treachery. If the council believed him, she would be executed as a traitor, and Draven's recovery would be dismissed as a temporary lapse in judgment brought on by whatever poison she herself had supposedly been feeding him. "Where is Draven?" Ren asked, fighting to keep her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her. "The council has summoned him," Mira said. "They mean to hold a formal hearing tonight, before the entire court. Edmund has moved quickly, faster than any of us expected. He must have suspected for some time that you were closing in on the truth." Ren's mind raced through her options, each one more desperate than the last. She could flee the fortress now, disappearing into the night before the guards could find her, saving her own life at the cost of leaving Draven to face his uncle's lies alone, his newfound clarity and authority still too fragile to withstand a united council determined to see him fail. Or she could face the accusation directly, trusting that the truth, however dangerous to speak aloud, would ultimately prove itself against Edmund's carefully constructed deception. She thought of the fields back home, the children who had gone hungry through the long war, the peace that depended on this fragile alliance holding firm. She thought of Draven, of the man she had glimpsed beneath years of imposed madness, of the trust that had grown between them, in a chamber built for chains and despair. "I will not run," she said finally, drawing herself up despite the fear still gripping her chest. "If I flee now, Edmund's lies become truth by default. I would rather face him directly, and trust that what is real cannot be so easily buried." Mira grasped her hands tightly, tears standing in her eyes. "Then may whatever gods watch over this fortress grant you the courage you will need tonight." The great hall of the fortress had not seen a formal gathering of the full council in years, not since Draven's affliction had first confined him to his chamber and left the kingdom's governance to Edmund's steady, patient hand. Tonight, torches blazed along every wall, illuminating the assembled nobles and advisors who had gathered to hear the accusation laid before them, their faces a mixture of curiosity, concern, and in some cases, poorly hidden satisfaction at the prospect of a foreign healer's downfall. Ren was escorted into the hall by 2 guards, their grip on her arms firm but not unkind, more a formality demanded by the occasion than genuine restraint. She held her head high despite the weight of every eye upon her, searching the assembled crowd until she found Draven standing near the raised dais at the front of the hall, his expression carefully controlled, though she could see the tension coiled tight beneath his composed exterior. Edmund stood beside him, an older man with silver threading through dark hair, his bearing confident and unhurried, the picture of a loyal regent, concerned only for his nephew's welfare. When his eyes met Ren's across the crowded hall, she saw nothing there but calm satisfaction, the look of a man entirely certain of his own victory. "Bring the accused forward," Edmund announced, his voice carrying easily through the hall, rich with practiced authority. "Let the council hear the truth, of what has been happening within these walls. Ren was brought to stand before the dais, facing the assembled council members, who watched her with varying degrees of suspicion and pity. Edmund stepped forward, addressing the crowd with the smooth confidence of a man who had rehearsed his words carefully. "This woman," he began, gesturing toward Ren with practiced disdain, "arrived at our fortress, under the guise of the treaty, claiming to offer herself as a mate to our afflicted king. Yet in truth, she came bearing poison, slowly working to worsen his condition, while presenting herself as his healer and savior. When her scheme was discovered, hidden within the kitchen storeroom for anyone to find, she attempted to shift blame onto an innocent servant who had faithfully prepared the king's meals for years without incident." Murmurs rippled through the assembled council, some nodding along with Edmund's account, others glancing uncertainly toward Draven, waiting to see how their king would respond to the accusation laid against the woman who had somehow restored his mind after years of feral madness. "That is a lie," Ren said, her voice ringing clear through the hall despite the fear still tight in her chest. "I did not poison the king. I discovered the poison already present in his food, present for years before my arrival, and I have worked tirelessly since to counter its effects and identify who was truly responsible." "And who do you claim is responsible?" Edmund asked, his tone carrying just the right amount of skeptical challenge to sway the watching council toward his own version of events. Ren met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away, despite the danger she knew this moment carried. "I believe the servant Aldrich has been adding poison to the king's meals for years, under instructions from someone with the power and access to arrange such a deception without raising suspicion." "A convenient accusation," Edmund said smoothly, "made only after your own guilt was discovered. Tell me, healer, do you have any proof of this claim, or only the desperate word of a woman caught in her own scheme?" The hall fell silent, every eye turning toward Ren, waiting to see how she would answer a challenge that struck directly at the heart of her defense. She had witnessed Aldrich preparing the poison with her own eyes, but she had no physical proof to offer the council beyond her own testimony, and she could already see in the expressions around her that her word alone would not be enough against Edmund's carefully constructed narrative. One of the council members, an older woman named Lady Cassandra, who had served on the council since Draven's father's reign, leaned forward with a skeptical frown. "It is a serious thing to accuse a member of this council without proof beyond your own claim. Tell me, healer, if you discovered this poison so long ago, why did you not bring your suspicions before this council immediately, rather than continuing your visits to the king in secret?" "Because I did not yet understand who was responsible," Ren answered, keeping her voice steady, despite the mounting pressure of the hall's collective gaze. "An accusation made too early, without proof strong enough to withstand challenge, would only have endangered myself and the king further, giving the true culprit time to hide their tracks, or silence me, before the truth could come to light." "A convenient explanation," another council member muttered, just loud enough to carry. "Convenient or not, it is the truth," Ren said, refusing to let her voice waver. "I have spent every day since my arrival, watching closely, testing carefully, and gathering what evidence I could, without alerting whoever was responsible. I did not come to this fortress seeking to harm anyone. I came seeking peace for my people, and I have found instead a king worth saving, from a cruelty far greater than anyone here yet understands." Edmund seized on the moment of doubt rippling through the assembled council, his voice smooth and confident once more. "Words, and nothing more. This council has heard enough. I move that the accused be held for formal judgment, and that the servant Aldrich be released, his name cleared of any wrongdoing beyond what this woman falsely attempted to lay upon him." Several council members murmured in agreement, and for one terrible moment, Ren felt the tide of the hall turning fully against her, felt the weight of Edmund's carefully cultivated authority, pressing down on the assembly like an immovable stone. She glanced toward Draven, uncertain whether even his restored presence would be enough to stop the momentum Edmund had so skillfully built. It was then that Draven stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tense silence with the unmistakable authority of a king reclaiming his rightful place. "I have proof," he said, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath as one. Every eye in the hall turned toward Draven as he moved to stand beside Ren, his presence commanding in a way the court had not witnessed in years. Gone was the wild, chained creature the servants whispered about in fearful tones. In his place stood a king, tall and steady, his amber eyes clear and sharp, with a purpose that silenced even the boldest whispers among the gathered council. 2 nights ago, Draven continued, his voice carrying easily across the hall, guards under my direct command witnessed the servant Aldrich preparing a substance in the kitchen storeroom, mixing it with the same care and precision he has used for years while preparing my meals. They confirmed what Wren had already discovered through her own careful observation. I have that substance here, gathered as evidence before my uncle's accusation against her was ever raised. He produced a small leather satchel from beneath his cloak, holding it aloft for the council to see. Wren recognized it immediately as the one she had seen Aldrich handling in the storeroom, the very proof they had planned to gather before Edmund's swift accusation had thrown their careful plan into chaos. "Captain Callum," Draven said, turning toward his guard captain, who stepped forward from the edge of the hall at his king's summons. "Tell this council what you and your men witnessed 2 nights ago." Callum bowed briefly before addressing the assembly, his voice steady with the disciplined confidence of a soldier long accustomed to giving accurate reports. "My king ordered 2 guards and myself to conceal ourselves within the kitchen storeroom after dusk, following information provided by the healer Wren. We witnessed the servant Aldrich enter alone, retrieve a hidden pouch of dark powder from beneath a loose stone in the floor, and measure a portion of it carefully into a leather satchel matching the one my king now holds. We apprehended him immediately afterward and confiscated both the satchel and the remaining powder as evidence." "And you are certain," Lady Cassandra pressed, her earlier skepticism now turned fully toward uncovering the full truth, "that this was not merely an innocent servant preparing ordinary kitchen spices?" "I have served this fortress for many years, my lady," Callum answered evenly. "I know the difference between kitchen spice and a substance a man hides beneath a loose floor stone and measures with the careful secrecy of someone concealing a crime. There was no mistaking his intent, nor his fear, once he realized he had been discovered." The hall's earlier murmurs of doubt shifted noticeably at this corroborating testimony, several council members exchanging glances that suggested Edmund's carefully constructed narrative had begun to lose its hold on the assembly, even before Aldrich himself was brought forward to speak. "Bring Aldrich before this council," Draven commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. A tense silence fell over the hall as guards moved to retrieve the servant from wherever he had been held since the discovery 2 nights prior. When Aldrich was finally brought forward, his face pale and his hands bound, he would not meet anyone's eyes, least of all Edmund's, who stood rigid and silent near the dais, his earlier confidence beginning to show the first faint cracks of uncertainty. "Aldrich," Draven said, addressing the trembling servant directly, "tell this council the truth. Who instructed you to add this substance to my meals?" For a long moment, Aldrich said nothing, his eyes darting nervously between Draven and Edmund, clearly torn between fear of his king and fear of whoever had commanded his silence all these years. Wren watched the exchange with her heart pounding, understanding that everything now depended on whether this frightened servant would find the courage to speak the truth aloud before the assembled court. "Speak," Draven said, his voice softening slightly, though the authority in it remained unmistakable. "I promise you mercy if you tell the truth now. But if you continue this deception, you will share fully in the punishment of whoever ordered you to poison your own king." Aldrich's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him all at once. "It was Lord Edmund," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, though it carried clearly through the silent hall. "He came to me years ago, shortly after your father's death, and told me the kingdom needed careful guidance during a difficult time. He said the substance would only calm your temper, ease the transition of power while you learned to rule. I did not know, not truly, what it would do to you over time. By the time I understood the harm I was causing, I feared what would happen to me if I refused to continue." The hall erupted into a storm of murmurs and gasps, council members turning toward Edmund with expressions ranging from shock to dawning suspicion. Edmund's carefully composed mask finally slipped entirely, his face twisting with something between fury and desperation, as he realized how completely his plan had unraveled before the very court he had hoped to control. "This is madness," Edmund said, his voice rising sharply, all pretense of calm authority abandoned now. "A frightened servant will say anything to save his own neck. You cannot possibly believe the word of a man caught red-handed over that of your own blood, the uncle who has guided this kingdom faithfully through your illness." "I believe the evidence before me," Draven said, his voice cold and steady, despite the storm of emotion clearly churning beneath his composed exterior. I believe the poison found in my food, tested and confirmed by a healer, whose only crime was seeking to save my life. I believe the testimony of a servant who has finally found the courage to speak truth after years of fear. And I believe, above all else, the years I lost to chains and madness, while you governed my kingdom in my name, growing more comfortable with power that was never truly yours. Edmund's eyes darted around the hall, searching for allies among the council members who had once supported his regency, but found only faces turning away from him, unwilling to align themselves with a man so clearly exposed before their king. Whatever loyalty he had commanded during Draven's long illness evaporated in the face of such damning proof. You would believe a foreign healer over your own family, Edmund spat, all pretense abandoned now, his true bitterness finally surfacing after years of careful concealment. She came here as a peace offering, a mate meant to secure a treaty, nothing more. Yet you would take her word and risk everything I have built to protect this kingdom, on the claims of someone who does not even belong within these walls. She belongs here more than you do, Draven said, his voice quiet now, but carrying a weight that silenced the entire hall completely. She came to this fortress prepared to give her life for peace, and instead found the courage to save mine, asking nothing in return but the chance to see justice done. You, meanwhile, spent years poisoning your own blood, content to watch me suffer as a beast rather than see me rule as a king, simply because power tasted sweeter in my absence. The guards moved forward at Draven's silent signal, taking hold of Edmund before he could attempt any further protest or escape. The former regent's composure crumbled entirely as he was led from the hall, his shouted protests of innocence fading into the corridors beyond, leaving behind a silence heavy with the weight of truth, finally revealed after years of careful deception. Before Edmund was taken from the fortress entirely, Draven requested a final private moment with his uncle, a request the guards granted reluctantly, standing watch just outside the small chamber where the two men faced each other one last time. Ren waited nearby, close enough to hear if trouble arose, though she sensed this conversation was one Draven needed to have alone. Why? Draven asked simply, once the door had closed behind them. You were the only family I had left after my father died. I trusted you completely. Edmund's expression, stripped now of all pretense, showed something almost like genuine regret, though it did little to soften the weight of his crimes. I told myself, in the beginning, that I was protecting the kingdom. You were young, untested, grieving. I believed I could guide things quietly from behind the throne until you were ready to rule properly. But power has a way of reshaping a man's intentions the longer he holds it. I convinced myself, slowly, that I deserved to keep what I had only meant to borrow. You destroyed years of my life, Draven said quietly, no anger left in his voice now, only a tired sorrow. Years I can never reclaim. I know, Edmund said, and for just a moment, something like the Uncle Draven remembered from childhood flickered across his face. I will not ask for forgiveness I do not deserve. I only hope, in time, you find a way to rule better than I ever managed to guide you. Draven said nothing further, only nodded once to the waiting guards, who led Edmund away to begin the long journey toward permanent exile, beyond the kingdom's borders. He stood alone in the small chamber for a long moment afterward, feeling the strange, hollow weight of a chapter finally closing, before Ren stepped quietly through the door to stand beside him. Are you well? She asked softly. I do not know what I feel, Draven admitted. Relief, certainly, but grief as well, for the uncle I thought I knew, and for the years his betrayal cost me. Perhaps both can be true at once. They usually are, Ren said, resting her hand gently against his arm. Grief rarely arrives alone, but you do not have to carry it alone either. Draven turned to look at her, something steady and grateful settling over his features despite the weight of the morning's events. No, he agreed quietly. I do not. Ren stood motionless amid the chaos of the hall settling back into order, scarcely able to believe the accusation against her had been so thoroughly overturned. When she finally looked toward Draven, she found him already watching her, something warm and grateful shining clearly in his amber eyes, despite the exhaustion evident in every line of his posture. You saved my life twice tonight, he said quietly, moving closer, despite the watching council, no longer caring who witnessed the moment passing between them. Once when you cured the poison threatening my mind, and once again, when you refused to flee, despite the danger, My uncle's lies pose to your own safety. I only spoke the truth, Wren said, her voice unsteady, with the release of tension that had gripped her throughout the entire hearing. The truth simply needed a chance to be heard. Then let it be heard clearly, before this entire court, Draven said, turning to address the assembled council once more, his voice carrying the full weight of his restored authority. This woman came to us as an offering of peace between warring kingdoms. She leaves tonight, not as an offering, but as the one who broke the curse that held this kingdom hostage for years. Whatever gratitude this court owes me for my recovery, it owes tenfold to her. The council, still reeling from the swift reversal of fortune that had just unfolded before them, offered no objection, as Draven extended his hand toward Wren, drawing her gently to stand beside him at the front of the hall. For the first time since her arrival at the fortress, she felt not like a prisoner awaiting an uncertain fate, but like someone standing exactly where she was meant to be. As the hall slowly emptied that night, council members lingering in small clusters to discuss the astonishing turn events had taken, Lady Cassandra approached Draven and Wren directly, her earlier skepticism now replaced by something closer to quiet awe. In all my years serving this council, she said, I do not believe I have witnessed a more remarkable reversal of fortune, nor a more welcome one. This kingdom owes both of you a debt it will take considerable time to properly repay. The kingdom owes Wren far more than it owes me, Draven replied. I merely survived what was done to me. She is the one who found the courage and the wisdom to undo it. Other council members offered similar sentiments as they departed the hall that night, several pausing to offer Wren formal apologies for ever entertaining Edmund's accusations against her, though she accepted each with the same gracious patience she had shown throughout the ordeal, understanding that fear and uncertainty had made the council's doubt understandable, even if ultimately misplaced. By the time the great hall stood empty, torches burning low, and the last of the council's whispered conversations fading into the corridors beyond, Draven and Wren remained together near the dais, the weight of the evening's events finally settling over both of them, now that the immediate danger had passed. It is over, Wren said softly, still scarcely able to believe the words as she spoke them. The poisoning is over, Draven corrected gently, drawing her hand into his own. But I suspect what has begun between us is only just starting. In the weeks that followed Edmund's exposure, the fortress began to transform in ways that went far beyond the mere absence of chains in the northern chamber. Draven took up residence in the great hall once more, holding court each morning to address the concerns of his people, many of whom had never known him as anything but a distant, feared figure locked away from the world. Slowly, patiently, he worked to rebuild the trust that years of enforced madness had eroded, meeting with farmers whose lands had suffered during the long war, with soldiers who had fought without a true king to guide them, with merchants whose trade routes had been disrupted by years of uncertain governance. Lady Cassandra, the council member who had questioned Wren so sharply during the trial, sought her out privately a few days after Edmund's exile, finding her tending the small garden near the infirmary. The older woman approached with visible hesitation, her usual composed authority softened by something like genuine remorse. I owe you an apology, Lady Cassandra said without preamble, settling onto the stone bench nearby. I doubted you before this council, questioned your honesty when you had done nothing but tell the truth, at great risk to yourself. I have served on this council long enough to know better than to let a smooth voice convince me of a false narrative, yet Edmund's deception fooled me as thoroughly as it fooled everyone else. You had no reason to trust a stranger over a man who had guided this kingdom faithfully for years, at least as far as anyone knew, Wren said gently. I do not fault you for questioning me. It was your duty to question everything laid before that council, and you performed it well, even if the answer proved uncomfortable in the end. Still, Lady Cassandra said, I would ask your forgiveness, and perhaps your friendship, if you are willing to extend it to an old woman who nearly helped condemn an innocent healer through her own misplaced loyalty. Wren smiled, setting down her trowel to clasp the other woman's offered hand. Friendship, freely given. We have both learned something valuable from this ordeal, I think. Trust is a fragile thing, easily exploited by those clever enough to disguise their intentions, but it is worth rebuilding all the same, carefully and honestly, one conversation at a time. From that day forward, Lady Cassandra became one of Wren's staunchest allies within the council, often speaking on her behalf during the early months of Draven's restored rule. When when some among the nobility still harbored quiet doubts about a foreign healer's growing influence within the fortress. Her support, combined with the steady trust Draven himself continued to demonstrate, gradually won over even the most skeptical voices among the assembled lords and ladies. One quiet afternoon during those early weeks of rebuilding, Draven led Ren to a small gallery within the fortress that had remained locked for years, untouched since his affliction first began. Dust lay thick over the portraits hanging along its walls, generations of Ashbourne rulers gazing down from gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to watch the two of them enter the forgotten room. He stopped before a portrait near the center of the gallery, wiping away a layer of dust with careful reverence to reveal the painted image of a broad-shouldered man, with kind eyes and dark hair, so similar to Draven's own features that Ren felt an immediate pang of recognition, even without needing to ask who the painting depicted. "My father," Draven said quietly, confirming her guess. "I could not bear to look at his portrait during the years of my affliction. I feared I had failed him too completely to face his painted gaze, let alone his memory." Ren studied the portrait carefully, noting the warmth captured even in still paint, the slight upward curve at the corner of the king's mouth that suggested a man who smiled easily and often. "He looks like someone who would be proud of the son standing before me now," she said gently. "I hope that is true," Draven said. "I spent so many years believing I had disgraced everything he built, that the kingdom he left me had fallen into ruin because of some fundamental weakness in my own character. I did not understand, until you helped me see clearly again, that the fault was never mine to bear. It was poison, deliberately given, not weakness of blood or spirit. Guilt has a way of settling into the spaces illness leaves behind," Ren said, "convincing us we deserved whatever suffering came, even when the truth says otherwise entirely. You did not fail your father, Draven. You survived a betrayal cruel enough to break far stronger men, and you found your way back regardless." Draven reached out to trace the edge of the portrait's frame, something tender and grateful moving across his features. "I would like to have this cleaned and restored, and moved somewhere I might see it daily. I think, after everything, I am finally ready to remember him without the weight of guilt clouding every memory." "Then let us have it done," Ren said, resting her hand against his arm. "Memory deserves better than dust and locked doors, especially memory as precious as this." They spent the remainder of that afternoon walking slowly through the small gallery together, Draven sharing stories of ancestors long past, of battles won and treaties forged, of a lineage that had weathered its share of hardship across the generations, yet always found its way back towards stability and strength. By the time they finally left the gallery, the portrait of his father had been carefully uncovered and cleaned, ready to be moved to a place of honor within the fortress, a quiet testament to a healing that reached backward through memory, as much as it reached forward into whatever future still awaited them. Ren remained by his side through much of this rebuilding, though she insisted on continuing her own work as a healer whenever she could find the time. She established a small infirmary within the fortress walls, training several of the younger servants in basic care and remedy, determined that no illness within these walls would ever again go unnoticed or unaddressed, the way Draven's poisoning had for so many years. Among her first apprentices was a quiet young woman named Tilda, a scullery maid, who had shown a natural gift for noticing when someone in the fortress felt unwell, before they themselves recognized the signs. Ren took the girl under her guidance carefully, teaching her the same careful observation skills that had first allowed Ren to notice the pattern of Draven's worsening symptoms after each meal. "You have sharp eyes, Tilda," Ren told her one afternoon, as the girl correctly identified early signs of fever in a young guardsman, well before the illness had fully taken hold. "Sharper than many trained healers I have known. The gift is not something that can be taught entirely, only guided once it is recognized." "I only watch closely," Tilda said, somewhat shyly, unused to praise after years spent largely unnoticed among the fortress staff. "You taught me to watch closely, my lady. Before you arrived, I did not understand that noticing was itself a kind of skill worth developing." "Then you have already learned the most important lesson a healer can offer," Ren said warmly. "The rest is simply practice, and patience, and the willingness to trust what your careful eyes tell you, even when others might dismiss such details as unimportant." Within a year, Tilda had grown skilled enough to manage minor ailments entirely on her own, freeing Ren to focus on more complex cases, and on the ongoing task of documenting everything she had learned about the rare poison that had nearly destroyed the kingdom's king, ensuring that should such cruelty ever be attempted again, within these walls or any other, the signs would be recognized far more quickly than they had been the first time. Edmund's trial, when it finally came before the full assembly of nobles from across the kingdom, revealed the full extent of his deception. He had begun poisoning Draven not out of any single moment of malice, but through a slow accumulation of resentment, believing himself more capable of ruling the kingdom than his young nephew, convinced that his own steady hand would serve the people better than an untested king barely past his coronation. What began as small doses meant only to make Draven more pliable and easier to guide had grown, over years, into something far darker, as Edmund found himself increasingly unwilling to relinquish the power he had grown accustomed to holding. Callum, who had guarded the northern chamber faithfully through the darkest years of Draven's affliction, stood before his king a few days after the trial concluded, uncertain what his future within the fortress might hold now that the chamber he had guarded for so long no longer required a keeper. "My king," he said, bowing formally, "I have served as your guard through years that asked much and offered little in return. I do not know what role remains for me now that you no longer require confinement." Draven regarded him with something warm crossing his features, a far cry from the wary distance that had once defined their interactions through the iron door. "You served me faithfully, when it would have been easier to abandon the task entirely, Callum. Many guards would have requested reassignment, rather than face what you faced each day, standing watch over a king the whole court believed beyond saving." "I only did my duty," Callum said, though a flush of pride colored his weathered face. "You did far more than duty required," Draven said. "I remember, even through the worst of the poison's grip, moments where your voice reached me, steady and calm, when everything else in my mind had turned to chaos. I would have you serve now as captain of my personal guard, a position of trust I do not offer lightly." Callum's composure faltered for just a moment, genuine emotion breaking through his usual soldierly reserve. "It would be my honor, my king." "The honor is mine," Draven said, "to have had such loyalty standing outside my door through years, when I gave you little reason to believe your service mattered at all." The council, hearing the full account of years of careful poisoning, stripped Edmund of every title and privilege he had once held, exiling him from the kingdom's borders under strict guard, forbidden ever to return, under threat of far harsher justice. Aldrich, whose testimony had proven crucial in exposing the truth, received a lighter sentence in recognition of his cooperation, though he too was removed from any position of trust within the fortress, sent instead to serve out his years in a distant village, far from the halls where his actions had caused such lasting harm. With the immediate crisis resolved, Draven found himself facing a different kind of challenge, one that had nothing to do with poison or betrayal, and everything to do with the quiet uncertainty of what came next. He sought Ren out one evening as the sun set over the northern hills, finding her in the small garden she had begun cultivating near the infirmary, tending to the same pale blue flowers that had provided the cure for his affliction. "These grow well here," he observed, settling onto the stone bench beside where she knelt among the flower beds. "They prefer rocky soil and plenty of sunlight," Ren said, brushing dirt from her hands as she looked up at him. "Much like the hillside where I first found them." "I have been thinking," Draven said, something uncharacteristically hesitant in his tone, "about the treaty that first brought you to this fortress. About the arrangement the council made, sending you here as an offering, meant to secure peace between our peoples." Ren's heart quickened slightly at his words, uncertain where this conversation might lead. "The treaty has been fulfilled," she said carefully. "You are recovered, and the war between our kingdoms has ended. I do not believe anyone would fault you for releasing me from any further obligation, if that is what you wish to discuss." "That is not what I wish to discuss at all," Draven said, turning to face her fully, his amber eyes steady and clear in the fading evening light. "I wish to discuss what happens next, not because of any treaty or political necessity, but because of what has grown between us since that first night you knelt before me in the dark, unafraid, despite everything you had been warned about." Ren set down the small trowel she had been using, giving him her full attention, her heart pounding now for reasons that had nothing to do with fear or danger. What are you asking, my king? I am asking, Draven said, reaching out to take her hand gently in his own, whether you would consider staying here, not because a treaty demands it, but because you might wish to build a life within these walls, beside a king who owes you more than he could ever properly repay, and who has come to care for you, far beyond the debt of gratitude he carries. I have already decided to stay, Ren said softly, her fingers curling around his. I decided somewhere between that first terrifying night and every day since, watching you reclaim not just your throne, but yourself. I did not need to be asked. Then let me ask regardless, Draven said, a smile finally breaking across features that had spent so many years locked in either fear or rage, something Ren realized she had rarely seen from him until these recent weeks of healing. Will you remain here, Ren, not as an offering of peace between kingdoms, but as the woman I have come to trust above all others, the one whose courage restored my mind, and whose presence has given me reason to want to be worthy of the throne I once thought lost to me forever? Yes, Ren answered, her voice steady, despite the emotion swelling in her chest. I will stay. Draven raised her hand to his lips then, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, a far cry from the desperate, dangerous moment weeks earlier, when she had risked everything to deliver the cure that saved his mind. This kiss carried no urgency, no fear, only the quiet promise of something lasting being built between two people who had found each other in the darkest circumstances imaginable, and chosen, deliberately and freely, to remain. News of the king's recovery and the exposure of his uncle's treachery spread quickly beyond the fortress walls, carried by merchants and travelers to every corner of the kingdom and beyond. The story of the Omega healer who had walked willingly into a feral king's chamber, who had refused to flee even when falsely accused of treason, who had ultimately restored both a king's sanity and his throne, became something people spoke of in taverns and marketplaces far from the northern territories, a tale of courage rewarded and trust vindicated against every expectation. Within the fortress itself, the change was even more profound. The servants who had once whispered fearfully about the chamber at the end of the northern corridor now spoke openly of their king's steady, thoughtful governance, of the healer who had become something far more than a political arrangement, of a court finally free from the shadow of hidden poison and quiet betrayal that had haunted its halls for years. Mira, watching from the kitchen doorway one evening as Draven and Ren walked together through the fortress gardens, found herself smiling at how far both of them had come since that first frightened night when Ren had carried a tray up the long staircase, uncertain if she would return at all. Who would have believed it, she murmured to herself, returning to her work with a lightness in her step that had been absent from the fortress kitchens for far too many years. A poison meant to destroy a king, undone instead by the very trust it was designed to prevent from ever taking root. Before the formal announcement to the council, Draven insisted that Ren travel back to her own village, accompanied by a small honor guard, to see with her own eyes what the peace treaty had already begun to accomplish for her people. She had not returned home since the day she volunteered to be sent to the fortress, and the journey back down the familiar dirt roads filled her with an anxious mixture of hope and uncertainty. The village looked different from how she remembered it, though only weeks had passed since her departure. The fields, once trampled and neglected during the long years of conflict, now showed the first green shoots of new planting. Children ran through the square without the fearful glances toward the horizon that had marked their play before, no longer watching for soldiers who might arrive to take more than the village could spare. Her old teacher, an elderly healer named Bram, who had trained her since she was a girl, met her at the edge of the village with tears standing openly in his eyes. We heard the stories, he said, embracing her warmly. That the Omega sent to the feral king had not only survived, but had broken the curse that held him, and exposed a traitor within his own court. We did not dare believe it until we saw the soldiers withdraw from our borders, and the grain shipments begin arriving from the north. It is true, Ren said, smiling despite the emotion tightening her throat. The king has recovered fully. The treaty holds, and it holds because of trust rather than fear. And what of you? Bram asked, studying her closely, with the same careful attention he had once used to teach her the properties of every herb in the surrounding hills. Will you remain at the fortress, or return home to us, now that your duty is fulfilled? Ren hesitated only a moment before answering, though the answer had lived clearly in her heart for weeks already. I will remain, she said. Not because duty demands it, but because I have found something there worth staying for." Bram's expression softened into understanding, and he patted her hand gently. "Then go with a healer's blessing, and know that your village will always welcome you home, whenever you wish to visit." She spent 2 full days in the village, tending to old friends and neighbors, sharing what she had learned during her time at the fortress, listening to stories of how the harvest had improved, and the war's shadow had finally begun to lift from daily life. When it came time to return north, she found herself surprised by how naturally the fortress had already begun to feel like home, even as she said her farewells to the place she had been born. The honor guard escorted her back along the same roads she had traveled weeks earlier, though the journey felt entirely different now, free of the fear and uncertainty that had accompanied her first passage toward the fortress. When the northern towers came into view against the darkening sky, she felt something settle warmly in her chest, a recognition she had not expected to feel so soon, for a place that had once seemed only a place of danger and duty. Draven met her at the fortress gates himself, foregoing the formality his position might have demanded, his relief at her safe return plain across his features. "How did you find your village?" he asked, walking beside her through the courtyard. "Healing," Ren answered simply. "Much like you." Before the wedding could be properly announced, however, one final matter of state required attention. Representatives from the Southern Kingdom, the very nation whose war had first brought Ren north as part of the original treaty, arrived at the fortress to formally conclude the peace negotiations that Draven's recovery had made possible. The Southern delegation was led by a dignified older statesman named Lord Percival, who had negotiated the original treaty terms years earlier, back when Draven's affliction had made any lasting peace seem impossible to secure. The formal signing ceremony took place in the Great Hall. Both delegations gathered beneath banners, representing their respective kingdoms, the air heavy with the weight of years of conflict, finally drawing to a close. Draven stood at the head of the northern delegation, Ren beside him, no longer merely a token of exchange, but a recognized partner in the negotiations that would determine the fate of both kingdoms for generations to come. "When this treaty was first proposed," Lord Percival said, addressing the assembled hall, "I confess I held little hope it would achieve anything beyond a temporary pause in hostilities. We sent an Omega healer north, expecting, if I am honest, that we were offering a sacrifice rather than a solution. What has been achieved instead exceeds anything either kingdom dared hope for." "The healer you sent," Draven said, taking Ren's hand as he spoke, "restored far more than my own mind. She restored the possibility of genuine peace between our peoples, built not on the uneasy truce of a forced treaty, but on trust freely given and courage freely offered." The formal documents were signed that afternoon, establishing not merely an end to hostilities, but a lasting alliance between the two kingdoms, with provisions for open trade routes, shared resources during lean harvests, and mutual aid should either kingdom face future threats from beyond their borders. Ren watched as her own name was included in the treaty's language, recognized formally as the bridge between two nations that had spent years locked in costly, needless conflict. Lord Percival approached her privately after the ceremony concluded, his expression carrying a warmth that had been entirely absent from his earlier, more formal demeanor. "Your village will be pleased to learn how thoroughly you have exceeded every expectation placed upon you," he said. Few could have predicted that the treaty's fulfillment would come not through sacrifice, but through genuine healing. "I only did what I believed was right," Ren said. "The kingdom's fate was never mine to decide alone. I simply refused to accept that a man could not be saved, or that peace could only be bought with someone's suffering. A rare philosophy for these times," Lord Percival said, "though one I hope more of our leaders might learn to embrace, going forward." With the treaty formally sealed, and the war between the two kingdoms concluded in full, the path toward Draven and Ren's wedding lay clear before them, unburdened now by any lingering political necessity, free to be celebrated as what it had truly become, a union chosen freely by two people who had found, in the darkest circumstances imaginable, something worth building a lasting future upon. As autumn settled over the northern territories, bringing crisp winds and the first signs of winter's approach, Draven stood once more before his assembled council, this time not to face an accusation, but to formally announce his intention to take Ren as his true mate, sealing not just the peace between two kingdoms, but a bond that had grown from courage, patience, and an unwavering trust that had somehow survived even the darkest circumstances the fortress had ever witnessed. Ren stood beside him as he spoke, no longer the frightened healer who had knelt before a feral king in a chained and darkened chamber, but a woman who had found, in the most unlikely of places, both purpose and belonging. She thought back often to that first night, to the growling and the chains and the fear that had gripped her as she stepped through that iron door, uncertain if she would live to see morning. She had not known then that trust, whispered quietly in the dark, could unmake years of carefully constructed poison and cruelty. She had not known that a beast, feared by an entire kingdom, carried within him a man worth saving, worth trusting, worth loving. But she knew it now, standing beside him as the council offered their formal blessing, watching the amber warmth in his eyes as he turned to look at her, no longer haunted by wildness or rage, but steady and clear and entirely his own. The wedding itself was held on the first clear morning after the harvest moon, when the northern hills had turned gold and copper with the last warmth of the season before winter's arrival. Preparations had consumed the fortress for nearly a month, with Mira overseeing an enormous feast that would draw from every corner of the kingdom's bounty, and Alara personally supervising the decoration of the great hall, with garlands of the same pale blue flowers Ren had once gathered from the rocky hillside to cure the king's affliction. Ren stood in a small antechamber that morning, dressed in a gown of deep blue silk trimmed with silver thread, her hands trembling slightly, though not from fear this time. Alara fussed over the final details of her hair, weaving small white blossoms through the dark strands with practiced care. "You are not nervous, are you?" Alara asked, catching sight of Ren's expression in the small mirror propped against the wall. "A little," Ren admitted, a small laugh escaping her despite the flutter in her stomach. "It is strange, is it not? I walked into that fortress prepared to face a feral king who might kill me on sight, and I felt less nervous then than I do now, waiting to marry the man he has become. That is because back then, you had nothing to lose," Alara said gently, tucking one final flower into place. "Now you have everything to lose, and everything to gain. It is only natural that such a day would fill you with more feeling than the one that nearly ended your life." A soft knock came at the door, and Mira entered, her face flushed from the kitchens but wreathed in genuine happiness. "The hall is ready," she said, "and the king waits at the end of the aisle, looking nearly as nervous as you, if I may say so." Ren smiled, smoothing the front of her gown one final time, before allowing Alara and Mira to escort her toward the great hall, where the doors stood open, to reveal a room transformed entirely from the tense, torch-lit chamber, where Edmund's trial had once unfolded. Garlands of pale blue flowers draped every column and archway, and sunlight streamed through the high windows, filling the space with a warmth that seemed to banish every shadow the fortress had once held. The assembled guests rose as Ren entered, a mixture of nobles from across the kingdom, villagers who had traveled from her own home to witness the ceremony, and the fortress staff who had come to know her these past months, all watching with expressions of genuine warmth, rather than the fearful curiosity that had greeted her upon her first arrival. Draven stood at the front of the hall beside Lady Cassandra, who had been asked to officiate the ceremony in recognition of her long service to the kingdom and her role in helping rebuild the council's trust after Edmund's betrayal. He wore formal robes of deep green and gold, the colors of his household, though nothing about his bearing carried the wildness or fear that had once defined him. His amber eyes found Ren's the moment she stepped through the doors, and something in his expression made the distance between them feel both impossibly long and entirely too short. She walked the length of the hall on Callum's arm, the guard captain having become something like family to her during her months at the fortress, his usual stern composure softened today by obvious pride at the honor of escorting her toward her waiting king. "You look every bit the queen this kingdom needs," Callum murmured as they walked, and Ren squeezed his arm gratefully in response, too full of emotion to trust her voice just yet. When she reached the front of the hall, Draven took her hands in his grip warm and steady, nothing like the trembling claws that had once frightened even his own guards. Lady Cassandra began the ceremony with words that spoke of trust rebuilt, of peace secured, not through force but through courage, of two people who had found each other in circumstances neither would have chosen, yet who had built something worth choosing, again and again, in the months that followed. "Do you, Draven Ashbourne, king of these northern lands, take this woman as your true mate?" Lady Cassandra asked, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, promising to honor her courage, protect her well-being, and stand beside her through whatever trials may yet come. "I do," Draven said, his voice steady and sure, carrying none of the roughness that had once marked his speech in the darkness of his chained chamber. I promise this and more, for she has already proven herself worthy of every trust I could ever offer. And do you, Ren, healer of the southern villages, take this man as your true mate, Lady Cassandra continued, turning to face her, promising to stand beside him, not as an obligation of treaty or duty, but as a choice made freely, again and again, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Ren answered, her voice clear, despite the tears gathering in her eyes. I chose him the moment I refused to leave that chamber, and I choose him again today, and every day that follows. The hall erupted into warm applause as Draven leaned forward to seal their vows with a kiss far gentler than the desperate, dangerous one that had first cured him weeks earlier, yet carrying within it every bit of the trust and devotion that had grown between them since that terrifying first night. When they parted, Draven rested his forehead gently against hers, a private moment amid the public celebration. Trust me, my king, Ren whispered, echoing the very words that had once saved his life, though now they carried no danger at all, only promise. Always, Draven whispered back, for the rest of my days. The feast that followed lasted well into the evening, musicians filling the fortress courtyard with music, while villagers and nobles alike danced beneath torchlight, sharing food and stories, with a freedom the fortress had not witnessed in years. Bram traveled from Ren's village to attend, embracing her warmly amid the celebration, and declaring, to anyone who would listen, that he had always known his finest student would accomplish something remarkable, though even he had not imagined she would end up healing an entire kingdom in the process. Mira's feast proved the finest the fortress kitchens had produced in living memory, course after course arriving to the delighted approval of every guest, while Ilara, finally able to enjoy a celebration rather than simply organize one, danced late into the night with a young guardsman named Finian, who had first caught her attention months earlier, during the tense weeks of Edmund's exposure, when his steady composure under pressure had impressed her far more than she initially let herself admit. You seem to be enjoying yourself, Ren observed with a knowing smile, catching Ilara during a brief pause between dances, her cheeks flushed with laughter and the warmth of the celebration. I confess I am, Ilara admitted, glancing back toward Finian, who waited patiently near the edge of the dance floor. He asked me to walk with him along the ramparts tomorrow evening, to watch the sunset. I find myself looking forward to it more than I have looked forward to anything in a very long while. Then I hope it brings you as much happiness as this fortress has brought me, Ren said warmly, squeezing her friend's hand, before Ilara returned to the dance floor, her laughter carrying easily over the music that filled the courtyard well past midnight. Callum stood near the edge of the courtyard for much of the evening, watching over the celebration with the same quiet vigilance he had once devoted to guarding a chained and feral king, though now his watchfulness carried none of the old dread, only satisfaction at how far both his king and the healer who saved him had traveled together. Late that night, when the music had finally quieted and most of the guests had retired to their beds, Draven and Ren stood together on the fortress ramparts, looking out over the northern hills, bathed in moonlight, the same hills where she had once searched desperately for a cure among rocky crevices and pale blue petals. Do you remember, Draven asked quietly, what you said to me, that very first night, when I told you that you should be afraid? I remember, Ren said, leaning against him as his arms settled warmly around her shoulders. I told you that fear did not have to make my choices for me. I have thought of that often, these past months, Draven admitted. It was the first thing anyone had said to me in years that did not sound like either pity or fear. I believe some part of me began to heal in that very moment, long before you ever discovered the poison or delivered the cure. Perhaps healing begins with trust, Ren said softly, long before it ever reaches the body. Perhaps that is the only cure that truly matters, in the end. They stood together in comfortable silence for a long while after that, two people who had found, in the darkest corner of a feral king's fortress, something neither had dared to hope for, a partnership, built not on the desperate terms of a wartime treaty, but on courage, freely given, and trust patiently earned, strong enough now to weather whatever challenges the kingdom of Ashbourne might yet face in the years ahead. The kingdom of Ashbourne, so long troubled by whispers of a cursed and feral king, entered a new era that autumn, one built not on fear or forced peace, but on the quiet, unshakable trust between a king restored to himself and the healer who had refused to give up on him, even when the whole world had already decided he was beyond saving. And in the years that followed, when travelers passed through the northern territories and asked after the fortress on the hill, the people who lived beneath its walls no longer spoke of chains or feral rage. They spoke instead of a king who ruled with clarity and compassion, and of the queen beside him who had once whispered 2 words of trust into the darkness and changed everything that came after. A year passed swiftly after the wedding, marked by the steady rhythms of a kingdom finally at peace with itself and its neighbors. The fields across both the northern territories and Ren's southern village flourished under trade routes reopened and harvests no longer threatened by conscription or conflict. Draven governed with a steadiness that surprised even those council members who had known him since childhood, his judgment sharp, his temperament calm, his devotion to the well-being of his people evident in every decision he made. Ren's infirmary had grown considerably during that year, expanding from a single small room near the kitchens into a proper healing hall, staffed by several trained apprentices, all of whom she had personally selected and trained in the methods her own teacher Bram had once taught her. She traveled periodically between the fortress and her home village, strengthening the bonds between the 2 communities that the treaty had first joined and that genuine friendship had since deepened considerably. On the anniversary of their wedding, Draven found Ren once again tending her garden of pale blue flowers near the infirmary, the same flowers that had first provided the cure for his affliction all those months ago. The plants had spread considerably since that first small cluster she gathered from the hillside, now filling an entire section of the garden with their delicate color. "You have built quite a garden," Draven observed, settling onto the familiar stone bench beside her. "They remind me," Ren said, brushing dirt from her hands, "of how something small and easily overlooked can hold within it the power to change everything, given the patience to find it and the courage to use it." Draven reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together in the gesture that had become as familiar to them now as breathing. "I think of that often, how close I came to spending the remainder of my life locked in that chamber, forgotten and feared, had you not been brave enough to kneel before me that first terrible night." "And I think often," Ren said, leaning into his shoulder, "of how close I came to losing my own courage entirely, had you not shown me, in those brief flickers of clarity, that the man beneath the affliction was worth every risk I took to reach him." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, the fortress behind them no longer a place of chains and fear, but a home built steadily on trust, earned through hardship and preserved through daily choice. Callum found them there as evening approached, his role as captain of the guard having settled into a comfortable rhythm that suited him far better than the anxious vigilance of his earlier years. "My king," he said, offering a respectful bow that had long since become more habit of affection than formal duty, "the council awaits your presence for the evening report, whenever you are ready." "Tell them I will be along shortly," Draven said, rising and offering his hand to help Ren to her feet. "Some things are worth a few extra minutes of delay." As they walked back toward the fortress together, the pale blue flowers swaying gently in the evening breeze behind them, Ren found herself reflecting on how thoroughly her life had transformed since that first frightened journey north, carried in a cart with barely a blanket against the cold, prepared to offer herself as a sacrifice for peace she never expected to witness firsthand. She had come seeking to save her people through whatever sacrifice was required of her. She had found instead a purpose far greater than she had imagined, a partnership built on courage and trust, a kingdom healed alongside the king who ruled it, and a home she had never expected to find within walls that once seemed to promise only danger and despair. She thought, too, of everyone whose small acts of courage had carried her toward this moment, people who might never appear in the grand tellings of the tale, yet whose quiet bravery had made all the difference. Mira, who had shared her own grief in order to offer trust to a stranger. Callum, who had stepped between danger and an unarmed healer without a moment's hesitation. Ilara, whose warm friendship had steadied her through the loneliest nights of her arrival. Lady Cassandra, who had questioned her fairly and then, upon learning the truth, extended her friendship without reservation. Each of them had added their own small thread to the larger tapestry of trust that had ultimately unraveled years of hidden cruelty and restored a kingdom to itself. The story of the Omega Healer and the Feral King continued to be told throughout both kingdoms in the years that followed, growing softer and warmer with each retelling, though the truth at its heart remained unchanged from that very first night. A woman had knelt before a chained and feral king, unafraid despite every warning, and whispered 2 words that would ultimately unmake years of poison and betrayal, replacing fear with trust, and madness with the steady, healing patience of someone who refused to believe that any person, however broken, lay beyond the reach of saving. "Trust me, my king," she had whispered in the darkness, and in time, that single whispered promise had changed everything that came after. For a king, for a kingdom, and for a healer who had never expected to find her own home in the very place she once feared she would lose her life.